and then share screen. Okay, so let's see. We don't want that. We don't want that. What do we want? We want that. All right. On the YouTube channel, we could start there. So like I said, um, if you, um, the first thing is know where the modules are, right? And then in the modules, there's a set of materials. And if you watch the videos, and you can see there's review session for paper one, um, and actually, hold on, let's refresh because I think there's more on here as well. There you go. So the review paper for the brief session for paper one, that was the one I did at noon. And then a slightly longer one at 7 p.m. on that Tuesday evening, also going over the same paper. And in those lectures, I go over, like where we look at modules, we open up every document that's in modules, and I talk about what's the things to get out of them. So I would recommend watching the videos just for that purpose. And then I also come to the YouTube channel. And so there are those videos here. Let's go to the channel itself the way you would see it if you first came to it, right? This is the home page. If you go to playlists, you can find some videos under reviews of tests and papers.
Welcome.
I keep doing it every time. I click on the video instead of on the playlist. And it's like I haven't done YouTube for, 15 years now. You guys get older, you make the same mistakes just more often. And okay, so there is review for comparison paper part 4, review for comparison paper part 3, and review for comparison paper part 1. It's a bit of a mystery as to what happened to part 2. It may be that I have 2 part 1s, and that's why. So you might have to watch them to figure that out. But that's a lot right there where I'm going through. And in this first one, which is part 1, I spend almost all the video just talking about looking at the 2 paintings and talking about the differences between the 2 paintings. So I recommend that. But then if you go to the bottom of this playlist, you'll see the most recent review sessions on the paper. You'll also see the review sessions from the previous quizzes and tests. Okay. Speaking of which, don't forget that midterms are this week. So the midterm test will open up on 8:30 on Thursday night. And because it's midterms, I'm going to give you a little bit extra time. I'm also going to push back some deadlines on other things as well, just to give everyone a little bit of a shift in time, a little extra breathing room. And so the midterm will be open starting on Thursday night all the way through to Thursday at to Sunday at midnight. Okay. Anyway, so there's that playlist. If we go back and
Welcome
back again,
this is the first video I've recorded.
and we go to, there's another playlist right at the start that's just called Zoom meetings. And just about everything that I do where I record them as a class Zoom meeting, once again, I clicked on the video instead of the playlist. I'm like, it's the same mistakes again and again. Okay. And in this one, let's see, the latest ones are, so you can actually find those same review sessions at the bottom of this playlist. But the most important ones for you are going to be this lecture right here, Components of Design Part 1, as well as the Components of Design Part 2, where it really goes over hierarchy and emphasis, but especially the first one. In the first one, I go through all of the design elements or art elements, all the design principles, and I kind of relatively briefly cover some of the other design concepts, but it basically is giving you a big, broad overview of what we mean by art elements, what we mean by design concepts. Whereas in terms of the lectures for each unit, I usually kind of zoom in on one and just talk about that. So like in the first unit, I just talked about line, right? Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So there's that on the YouTube page. So there's there's a couple of documents and some stuff available for you in the module for the paper. And then on top of that, I also sent you a PDF and a PowerPoint document. You can look at it either way, whichever whichever opens up. Like generally, the PowerPoint's a much bigger file, so you might have a hard time opening it up. But the PDF you can also view. And in it, I show you a number of ways. Actually, I might pull that up just so you can see it. So what I sent to you was this document right here. Let's go to slideshow from beginning. And like it literally is me showing you different ways of looking at the differences between these paintings. And so I'm literally kind of processing the images in different ways to point out some different things about them. So number one, looking at them black and white. Number two, looking at them blurry, looking at the blurry and upside down. That may seem kind of silly, but it helps you to see like certain things more clearly. Like it helps you to see the organization of shapes, the grouping of shapes, um, even more blurry. I have this comparison where I'm showing you kind of like the differences between the movements in the pieces, how they relate to the kind of the page hierarchy, page organization, the page geometry. I do this where I break both the paintings up into tiles and then just randomly organize, you know, rearrange the tiles so that you can't really see the whole picture, but instead you can just kind of see, it gives you a much clearer sense of like which colors are being used predominantly, which values, you know, which one is predominantly lighter, which one is predominantly darker, and stuff like that. And then I do the same thing that this is also available under modules where you can see the paintings in large scale really. And then I also have some extra comparisons for you to just kind of think about other ways of comparing works of art. And then if you watch that video, comparison part one, or review for comparison paper part one, I think is what it's called. I'm actually going through this lecture. Okay, so there you go. So that's, I think, pretty much everything that's available to you. And I strongly recommend, you know, I mean, of course, first draft is due at midnight. I'm going to give an extension, but, you know, right now it's due at midnight tonight. Um, and, you know, so you may not have a time to use all of those resources between now and tonight, but um, I would try to avail yourself to as much as possible. And um, what else would I say about that? Um, and then like when it comes to working on your second draft, you know, definitely look at those and they'll help give you some guidance as to what to do better, what to do differently. Okay. Um, all right. So that's my general quick overview of everything that I covered yesterday in those two reviews. I still recommend watching those videos because that will give you a lot more information. But any questions about any of this?
No, sir.
Okay. Jasmine, you good? Are you ready for us to
Yes, I'm okay. Sorry. I'm just at work trying to listen. Sorry.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, and yeah, I mean sometimes wait, that's the wrong one. We want to look at this one. Okay, and we want to be up here. Slideshow. Okay, so the normally for almost every unit, I start with the art historical content first, and the art. So like Unit 5 was all about the Renaissance, and Unit 6 starts with the Baroque. And actually begins with there's a little tiny art historical period between the Renaissance and the Baroque called Mannerism. And I talked a little bit about that and so forth. And so we covered that, then the transition into the Baroque, and basically like the first 60, 70 years of the Baroque. And then in Unit 7, we'll cover kind of like the Baroque into the Rococo and into the Enlightenment. Um, and so that time period is one of the things about the Baroque is that the paintings um, they get significantly darker. And if you might remember from Unit 5 about the Renaissance, we introduced the term chiaroscuro, which means light and dark, right? And it's this idea that artists started to really get interested in modeling, meaning like how you make a form look like a believable modeled form. And that involved really them starting to think about how does light work, right? How is light shining across objects? And so you have paintings where they're really trying very hard to have like a believable, consistent light source, that the light source is the same, shining everything in the same way, coming from the same direction and stuff like that. And and the artists were much more comfortable in the Renaissance with more kind of extreme changes of value, right? Used to be that, or and people in general don't like if you think about it, what's the purpose of flash photography? Right? Flash is there primarily so that when we take photographs of people's faces, we don't see any shadows on their faces, right? Because it lights straight on, which is the thing I hate about flash photography, because it's the shadows that help make the form of people's heads and faces more real and more believable. So as a draftsman, as a person who draws and paints, I find flash photography to be abhorrent. It's the devil. And but anyway, people in general like to think of faces as flat things without lots of value contrast. But in the Renaissance, the artists all of a sudden were kind of starting to become comfortable with that. Like, oh yeah, a head is just like an arm. It's just like, any other object. It's just like a column of a building. It's got a light side and then it shifts to a dark side and there might be a reflected light on the other side. That's chiaroscuro. Into the Baroque, we start to have this developed style that we call tenebrism, 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 and it's kind of like this extreme form of chiaroscuro where the artist kind of sets up the scene almost like in a stage where everything is really dark and then there's one really strong light source. And so we can see examples of that right here on that very first page, right? And this style is strongly comes out of Caravaggio. And when I do the lecture, when you watch the lecture on the Baroque, you'll get that point that like there was really in a way just this one artist kind of pushed this direction and said, this is the thing that really I think looks the best. And and so he made a lot of these paintings where the overall background and the overall space is very dark, very dimly lit. But then there's this really strong light source coming usually from the side, coming from a direction, and that really strong light source very much reveals all the form, but the form then, like, look at how we lose as things move into shadows, we almost completely lose the form, right? Okay, and that's called tenebrism. See, there's the word right there. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we're talking about value in this unit, why it's the most appropriate time to be talking about value and value contrast. So, besides that, what are the things that we're going to be talking about in this lecture? We're going to be talking about the ways that we create value contrast. We're going to be talking about the different parts of value contrast, which may seem kind of odd, but there are multiple parts. It can be quite complex. I'm just going to be covering two main ways of thinking or two main characteristics of value contrast. Okay, and then we're going to be talking about how value contrast is used to create hierarchy, create emphasis, and stuff like that. Okay, so once again, we start with the Baroque. The Baroque leads to tenebrism. That leads to us talking about value. So how do we create value and value contrast? Well, if you look at my text right there, I'm creating value and value contrast in two different ways, right? One way is that the text is getting thicker, right? Like the we're going from a thin type to a semi-fine to a regular um, to a semi-bold to a bold, right? All in one typeface. And at the same time, also the words are also shifting in how dark they are, right? Going from a lighter gray to a mid-value gray, all the way to a really dark gray, not quite black. So just in that, we're talking about kind of like there's two different ways of creating value contrast right there in that question. So here we go. Ways to create value contrast. So there's line weight, right? Of course, so like that word line and that word weight are the same value black, but they look very different from each other, right? Because one is bold and one is ultra light. Okay. Um, through mark repetition. I didn't have a typed way to represent repetition. I should have come up with something. Mark repetition, like hatching, cross hatching, where you build up marks on top of each other, and that can create value. Tone and gradation, right? Like when you take a black and white photograph, and like let's say took a black and white photograph of me with all that blurry background behind me, and that blurry background in black and white would just be these really soft, even tones of value. Now, when you really look up close to that photograph, if it's printed out, you'll see that that tone is actually made up of little tiny dots. So the difference between tone and between mark repetition is actually much blurrier than we would want as a firm rule. Distinct values, right? Like, so if you made a painting and you painted, let's say you wanted to do a painting of a fox, and you did the fox as a black silhouette, and then the space behind the fox was a gray space, right? It's just a silhouette of a black fox on a gray panel. There would be value contrast because you painted the shape of the fox with one value, one color, one, right, that was dark, and then another one for all the other areas that was a light. Okay. So that's distinct values. And similarly, every color has a value. So you could have done the exact same thing, and let's say that painted the fox a red, like a dark kind of alizarin crimson red, and then you could have painted the space, the negative space, let's say a chartreuse yellow green, right? Which would, even in this most saturated form, would be a light value color, right? And so we would have value contrast there, just like that blue is darker than that green. Right? Does everyone see that? Everyone recognize that?
Yes, sir.
It's a
Yes.
it's actually a pretty complex idea, that idea that every color has a value. And like when I'm teaching students in design class, we actually have to practice. We do things like where we squint our eyes. Squinting our eyes helps you to see value more clearly because you more rely on your rod cells instead of your cone cells in your eyes, right? Scientific fact. And so like in class, we'll have situations where we have to like have a color, like a square of a brightly painted red, and then they have to paint a gray that is the exact same value as that red. But how do they know is the exact same value, right? You learn through practice. And at first it's really hard. Like you think, oh, this is the same value. And then I'm like, no, that's too dark. And then they make another one, oh, this is like that's slightly lighter actually. I think you can go just a hair darker. And then they make another one, like, oh, that looks pretty close. And then I'm like, oh, let's stand back. Let's turn the lights off. Let's squint our eyes. What do we think? Um, and then, yeah. Okay, getting back to the lecture. So these are the different ways, right? Line weight, mark repetition, tone and gradation, distinct values, and color contrast. So let's start with line weight. So obviously in this drawing by John Byrne, there are areas where there's just a fill of value, but a lot of this drawing is done as a line drawing. And I want you to really look at what he's doing with the changes of the weight of line, right? And how they imply certain things. Like this implies that it's a dark value because it's the dark side of the form, but also because the calf muscle is being pressed against the thigh, right? And that makes a darker shadow right there. Or look at the way this line implies that the hand is casting a shadow onto the leg, right? Or similarly right there, and then it gets lighter again because nothing, but then it gets darker because it's moving away from the light. Every one of those shifts in that line is telling us something about what the light is doing. And so in the hand of a skilled draftsman, you can kind of like convince us about a whole lot about light and dark, and a whole lot about value just by changing the line weight. Okay. And then the same is true here with LeBron. Okay. But you can also, let's say you're doing a drawing where you're using pretty much the same width of line and the same darkness of ink again and again and again, but you could build up value contrast by just repeating marks over and over again. I think you can kind of clearly see in the pillows how the marks are repeated because the marks are pretty big, right? And how that repetition of marks can make, light values. Obviously, the lightest value is just simply not putting any marks on whatsoever. But you can have like light-ish values, you can have slightly darker values, or even darker all the way to really rich. But look at this print here, right? Every one of those values is built up, made out of lines. It doesn't look it to here. It looks like tone, right? It looks like, but it is actually entirely made out of lines, and I will prove it to you. So when we zoom in, it's still a little bit hard. Of course, partially because this version of the image is a little bit fuzzy, and we don't get the crisp clarity. But I found a better version of it, and I zoomed in on that one, and look what we see, right? See how all of that tone is just made out of line, out of line, out of line, out of line. Let's go zoom in a little bit more, right? Isn't that amazing? Okay, so like, let's go back to the original. So all of that, all of the effects of all those different values is all just made out of building up lines on top of lines on top of lines on top of lines. Okay. And so what is the difference between mark repetition and tone? It, like I said, it can be a bit blurry, right? Because like this drawing here, which feels like pure tone, is actually not pure tone because it's on a gray paper, and then the drawing is made up of hatching marks, very, very light and subtle hatching marks, both with various black charcoals and kind of like dark gray charcoals, and then one white kind of a drawing stick to get all the light values, right? And even this print, which is a mezzotint print, even that is made out of little tiny dots. And even this photograph, look at the tone in that photograph. I mean, it's so beautiful. And if I got like the highest quality image of it and blew it up on the screen, we still wouldn't be able to see the little tiny dots. But I have seen a Hiroshi Sugimoto photograph in person, and I kid you not, when you actually see the large scale prints of them, and you get out, a magnifying glass, you can actually see that that tone is made out of little grains, right? Little dark marks on the white paper. Okay. So there is, I guess there's pure tone, but even pure tone is still not entirely pure tone. But we also have distinct choices of value, right? I want you to think about this. You don't have to tell me the answer, but I want how many values are in this painting, LG for Spanish Republic? You don't have to say it, but just think about it for a second. So it's a complex question, right? The answer, a good answer would be three, right? Which is we have like this black, right? Which is pretty much the same everywhere. We have this white, but then we also have the color of the canvas, which is a separate value, right? See how it's darker than the white, right? So we actually have, but if you really get it in there, there are some marks here that are made with charcoal and with pencil that are not as black as black. So you could almost say, well, maybe four values, but predominantly it's these three values. But a lot of people would immediately just say, well, it's just two values. It's just black and white. But what about the color of the canvas? It's a separate value, right? Okay. So take a look at the Ellsworth Kelly painting. This is probably the second time we've seen this, maybe the third. And on this painting, I want you to kind of think about each color is a distinct value, right? Which one is the darkest value? Do you know?
Is it blue?
That's right. Yeah, it's the RGB blue, which is actually a blue slightly on the blue violet side, right? And it is a little bit darker than the red, right? And then the red is up, and the red and the blue are a lot darker than the yellow green, which is the RGB green, right? And as I said in that color lecture, like the RGB red here and the RGB blue and the RGB green are much closer in Ellsworth Kelly's painting than they are in the diagram, like the scientific diagram I have showing RGB red, RGB green, and RGB blue. So, sometimes the artists are a little bit more on top of things. Okay, so now we kind of understand, A, the different ways to make value contrast, but there's another thing we have to understand, which is what are the components of value contrast? And there are two main components. One is the range, right? And the range can be defined as what is the difference from the lightest light in a composition to the darkest dark in a composition. So how far, how wide a range that is, right? And when you talk about range, wide is the right term to use. Like if you say it has a lot of range, right? That's kind of a confusing, that's kind of like saying it's got a lot of value, right? But like every painting has a lot of value in that like everything has to be of value. Um, but when you say the value range is wide or the value range is narrow, that's a little bit more clear and specific. Okay. So, and then the other way to think about it is how fast does it go from the lights to the darks? And you can look at that both as an overall kind of assessment or even like kind of look at it in sections and say, as we're looking at this passage, how fast is the light moving from light to dark? Whoop. So here's a good example of the contrast between those two ways, right? These both feel like pretty high contrast images, but in a way, the pepper feels like a more high contrast image because it has the faster speed of gradation, right? The it feels like the light is shining pretty brightly and then we're moving into darkness really quickly, right? Does that kind of make sense? Whereas the light feels more evenly filtered across the artichoke, right? There is light there, but it doesn't have so much of a clear sense of direction, and it doesn't feel like we're going from light into dark the way we do with the pepper. But which painting has the wider range? The artichoke, not painting, the artichoke photograph has the wider range. It's really subtle, it's hard to see, but like the absolute darkest values here are actually slightly darker than the absolute darkest values there, just because of the process of like the kind of printing that was done to make this photograph. In fact, this was on a toned paper, the kind of printing that was done on this photograph. And then similarly, the lightest lights, there aren't many of them, but if you look at just a few little spots where you see the absolute lightest light, the lightest lights are significantly lighter than the lightest lights on this photograph because once again, it's on toned paper. Um, so, so therefore, the artichoke actually has the wider range, and yet the pepper is the one that feels like it has the greater value contrast. And that's kind of my proof as to why speed of gradation is actually the more important issue. Like how fast the values move from light to dark is the thing that we really respond to. Okay. So here are some examples of artists using very narrow ranges of value, right? Um, for Monet doing Rouen Cathedral, and we'll talk more about Rouen Cathedral paintings when we get to the second unit on color, the color of the advanced topics lecture, which is I think in unit 8. But with with this Monet painting, right, that really restrained value, the fact that none of the darks are all that dark, right, and that many of the shadows are in kind of light and light mid value colors, right, that overall very, very light range of the painting makes it really feel like it's very specific about a particular time of day, like very bright midday sunlight, like it's just the light is filling everything. Okay. Whereas Malevich is using an even narrower contrastive value, where essentially he just has one white color, which is a little bit cooler, and another white color that is just slightly darker and also warmer, right? He has these two, and then he also has a little bit of graphite, and the graphite is the line that he drew, but it also gets kind of mixed in to the paint, and so it slightly kind of affects the values of I mean, because after all, like that value is not the same as like that value, right? So there's as much change of value going on in each area of white as there is between the one white and the other white. So, um, so there's almost no contrast of value, but there is a little bit. And and the thing about reducing contrast is if you do it well, then you can make that small amount of contrast be really important. Okay, so lastly, we just need to talk about the way value is used in compositions. And one of the first things we want to talk about is how is value used in creating like hierarchy and emphasis. And so here are two different paintings that are doing kind of like the exact opposite, right? Which is that in the Caravaggio, because Caravaggio organizes his paintings to be overwhelmingly dark, right? And then the light moving into the space is the thing that kind of reveals everything. And the light often is the thing that tells the story, right? And here we have the calling of St. Matthew, and we have Jesus pointing, saying, "You," right? And here's St. Matthew going, "Who, me?" Right? And notice how it's interesting that St. Matthew, but really I feel like that figure right there who's leaning on St. Matthew is the one that most of the attention goes to because he's got that cool outfit and the cool hat, and he's got more lighter values on him, and so more kind of stands out in this dark space. So, whereas in the Seshitoyo ink wash, it's really the opposite, right? Which is the overall space is so very light and low contrast, right? Just these hints at the fact that we're in kind of a landscape space. It's like creating the illusion that we're looking at sort of like some sort of misty day. And then this rock outcropping with a little bit of trees and stuff on it just stands out because it has so much more valley contrast. It has so many more darker values. So in one, it's the addition of the extra dark values that makes it feel more contrasty in that section and therefore creates more emphasis. Whereas in the other, it's the addition of more light values and lighter of the light values that makes an area feel more contrasty and therefore makes it feel like it's more of an emphasis. Okay, so what about value grouping and how does it affect composition? Well, I think we've talked about this a little bit already, but we're going to talk about it again. So with the Rafted Medusa, which comes up all the time, and so make sure that you know the Rafted Medusa, make sure that you're prepared for it on the upcoming midterm, because I'm pretty sure it's going to be on there. If not as a 4 credit, it definitely as an extra credit. And so, you know, there's a lot to say about this painting. We don't have time to tell the whole story about the painting. I'll get into that in another unit. But what we do have time to talk about is the way that the values are organized, right? Like we have all this grouping of all these different figures all on this raft. And they're all looking for rescue. They're all waving, going, "Hey, is that a ship off in the distance?" And that's kind of like the story of what's going on here. But what's interesting is the way this grouping of all these different figures and then the light that's shining on them, it organizes them into this grouping of light values. It all twists and turns and meanders. And that's what moves our eye through all of this congestion, right? Our eye kind of follows the course of all these light shapes and dark shapes, rather and kind of like not so much looking at one person at a time. We kind of flow one shape into another shape. Okay. So let's look at some other paintings in terms of value. So we have in the Whistler we have an attempt at a much more limited range of value. Like there are some truly dark darks, right? But the vast majority of the painting is done in kind of light and like mid values and some like darker mid values. But then there are and purposely like notice how the really darkest values are either here right at the bottom or right around her head, right? And like that's kind of like very purposeful on part of Whistler. In the Gerhard Richter painting, it's much more restrained. None of the darks are super dark. Like that's probably the darkest value. And I think the blue that we're looking at there is probably Prussian blue. So that's close to the value of like the darkest black, but it's not quite that. And then none of the lights, all of the lights have a certain amount of blue to them. So like there's no pure white there in any part. So the range is a little bit more narrow, a little bit more in the middle. And then in the Sargent, we have a wider range, right, from the lightest value to the darkest value, but also it's much more overall dark, right? And so then the light values really kind of stand out. All right, and that is the end of the lecture on value. Probably this evening, I'll once again, do the same kind of thing where I'll kind of like quickly review the paper, maybe do a little bit of a review about the midterm coming up, and then I'll go into the next lecture here, which is on composition and page structure, which I think also would be pretty useful for you guys in terms of doing the paper. Okay, any questions?
No, sir.
Jasmine, you good? Oh, you want to maybe, let's see if I could, you can type it in chat, Jasmine, if you want. Do you have any questions, anything you want me to cover as a topic? We could go on for another 10 minutes if you want.
Yes, I'm okay. Sorry, I couldn't get to the back to my phone.
It is all right. I understand. Work can get busy. All right. Well, you both have a good rest of your day. I might be able to squeeze in a 5 o'clock lecture on a topic. I'm not sure. Just kind of depends. But I'll definitely be doing this. Oh, wait. No, tonight is Wednesday, so there won't be a 7 o'clock tonight. So maybe I'll just do a 5 o'clock. And so if but there will be a 7 p.m. lecture tomorrow night. And I'm trying to think if there's obviously by that point the paper will have already been due, but that will be kind of like in prep for the midterm. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, nice to talk to both of you. And once again, if you have any follow-up questions, you can always send me an email. All right.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Have
you.
a good rest of your afternoon.